London, April 1815. Viola Grantham stared at the imposing facade of Valemore House, clutching her sheaf of music so tightly that the pages crumpled beneath her gloved fingers. The three-story Mayfair mansion, with its imposing columns and gleaming windows, seemed to frown down at her, as if sensing she did not belong among the cream of society. Courage, she whispered to herself, smoothing her best muslin dress, a pale blue that had seen better days but still maintained a certain dignity. It is merely a position, like any other. Except it wasn't. Positions as piano instructors rarely came with such generous compensation. Nor did they typically place one in the household of the most notorious bachelor in London, Alexander Valemore, the Duke of Harrington, whose reputation for coldness was matched only by his reputation for impeccable taste in all things, particularly music. The butler who answered her knock was exactly what one might expect in service to such a household, tall, dignified, and possessing a gaze that assessed her worth in seconds and found it wanting. "Miss Grantham, I presume," he intoned, voice as starched as his cravat. "Yes, I have an appointment regarding the position of piano instructor." "Indeed." He gestured her inside with the barest minimum of movement required. "His Grace is occupied at present. You may wait in the music room." The music room, as it happened, was a revelation. Unlike the austere grandeur of the entrance hall, this chamber sang with warmth, rich burgundy draperies framing tall windows, walls adorned with paintings of composers and scenes from operas, and at its center, the most magnificent pianoforte Viola had ever beheld. A broadwood grand, its mahogany case gleaming with the patina that came only from loving care. Unable to resist, Viola approached it with reverence, running her fingertips lightly across the keys without pressing them. Her usual position at the modest seminary for young ladies where she taught allowed her access only to instruments well past their prime, their notes tinny and keys yellowed with age. "It is tuned weakly," came a deep voice from the doorway. "You may play it, if you wish." Viola whirled around, her heart leaping to her throat. The man who stood before her could only be the Duke, tall and imposing, with dark hair swept back from a face that poets might describe as handsome were it not for its complete lack of warmth. His eyes, a startling shade of grey, regarded her with the clinical interest one might show a particularly unusual specimen in a natural history museum. "Your Grace," she stammered, dropping into a curtsy so hurried she nearly lost her balance. "Forgive me. I did not mean to admire a fine instrument," he interrupted, entering the room with measured steps. "That is precisely what it is here for, Miss Grantham. I did not acquire it to serve as mere decoration." He gestured toward the bench. "Play something." It wasn't a request. Viola hesitated only a moment before seating herself. This was, after all, an audition of sorts. She had prepared several appropriate pieces, a minuet by Mozart, a sonata by Clementi, safe, respectable choices that demonstrated technical proficiency without risking impropriety. Yet as her fingers hovered above the keys, something entirely different called to her. Perhaps it was the splendid responsiveness of the instrument, or perhaps the Duke's cool assessment, but she suddenly yearned to play something that might crack that marble facade. She began Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, not the stately introduction, but directly into the passionate allegro, her fingers flying across the keys as the room filled with sound both turbulent and exquisitely controlled. The piece was perhaps too emotional for a proper audition, but on this magnificent instrument, the music seemed to pour not just from her fingers but from some hidden chamber of her soul. When she finished, breathless, she dared to look up. The Duke stood perfectly still, one hand resting on the pianoforte. His expression remained unreadable, yet something had shifted in those grey eyes, a flicker of, what? Surprise? Interest? It vanished too quickly to name. "You play with considerable feeling, Miss Grantham," he said at last. "Perhaps more than is strictly necessary for teaching scales to a child." Viola felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Music without feeling, Your Grace, is merely noise arranged in patterns." A faint line appeared between his brows. "An interesting philosophy. Not one I share, but interesting nonetheless." He moved to a writing desk in the corner, his movements economical and precise. "The position, as advertised, involves instructing my ward, Lady Margaret, who is 10 years of age and demonstrating some aptitude. 3 lessons weekly, with additional compensation for playing during small gatherings I occasionally host. Your ward. Viola couldn't hide her surprise. Nothing in the advertisement had mentioned a child. My late cousin's daughter, he clarified, his tone making it clear that further questions would be unwelcome. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, will show you out and provide the details of compensation. You may begin tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Just like that, she was hired? Viola remained seated, momentarily stunned. Unless, he added, glancing back with a raised eyebrow, you find the terms unsuitable. No. That is, they are most generous, Your Grace. I simply. She stood, gathering her composure along with her music sheets. I am grateful for the opportunity. He nodded once, already turning his attention elsewhere. Until tomorrow, then, Miss Grantham. Only after she had been shown out by the housekeeper, a kindly woman whose warmth stood in stark contrast to her employer, did Viola allow herself a moment of pure elation on the busy London street. The compensation was indeed generous, enough to significantly ease the financial burdens that had plagued her since her father's death 2 years prior. Yet as she made her way back to her modest lodgings, it was not the money that occupied her thoughts, but the brief, unguarded moment when the Duke's perfect composure had wavered at the sound of her music. The Duke of Harrington, meanwhile, stood at his study window, watching the slender figure of Miss Grantham as she disappeared into the London crowd. He had interviewed 3 other candidates for the position, all with impeccable credentials and letters of recommendation from countesses and viscountesses. All technically proficient. None had played like that. A dangerous choice, he murmured to himself, turning back to his correspondence. The last thing Margaret needed was to develop the sort of undisciplined emotionality Miss Grantham had displayed. Music was mathematics made audible, harmony, rhythm, proportion. Not this, whatever it was that had momentarily made him forget himself. He dipped his pen in ink, determined to put the matter from his mind. Miss Grantham was merely an employee, engaged to perform a specific function. Nothing more. Yet when he attempted to focus on his letter to Parliament, he found himself instead hearing the echo of Beethoven's passionate phrases, played by hands that somehow seemed to understand exactly what the composer had intended. ****** Lady Margaret Valemore proved to be nothing like the prim, proper child Viola had expected. Instead, the Duke's ward was a spirited girl with unruly auburn curls that escaped their ribbons and a distinct preference for climbing trees over practicing scales. Must we do this again? She sighed dramatically during their 3rd lesson, slumping on the piano bench. I've practiced the exercise exactly as you showed me, Miss Grantham. 14 times. I counted. Viola bit back a smile. And you've done admirably, Lady Margaret. But precision in music is like the foundation of a house, the girl recited. Yes, you said. But houses aren't meant to be lived in their foundations alone, are they? When do we build the interesting parts? A throat cleared from the doorway, and both Viola and Margaret straightened instantly. The Duke stood there, immaculate as always in a perfectly tailored coat of blue superfine, his cravat arranged in a complex knot that must have required his valet's undivided attention. I see my ward is displaying her characteristic impatience, he observed dryly. Margaret had the grace to look abashed. Cousin Alexander. We didn't hear you come in. Evidently. His gaze shifted to Viola. Miss Grantham, a moment of your time, if you please. Viola followed him into the adjoining drawing room, conscious of her plain muslin day dress beside his expensive tailoring. He had been largely absent during her previous visits, and she found herself unexpectedly nervous in his presence. I understand from Mrs. Winters that you've been punctual and diligent, he began without preamble. However, I must inquire about your methods. Margaret's previous instructor favored a more structured approach. By which you mean endless repetition of technical exercises, Viola replied, then hastily added, Your Grace. A faint twitch at the corner of his mouth might have been amusement, or annoyance. I believe in building proper foundations, Miss Grantham. As do I. but children learn best when technical mastery serves expression, rather than the reverse. Lady Margaret has a natural musicality that, she has enthusiasm, he interrupted, which, if not properly channeled, tends toward wildness. I did not engage your services to encourage further flights of fancy. Something in his tone, dismissive, coldly certain, sparked a flare of indignation in Viola's breast. With respect, Your Grace, true musicality cannot be imposed through drill alone. It must be nurtured alongside technical skill. An interesting theory. Not a theory. A truth known by any true musician. The words escaped before prudence could halt them. His eyebrows rose fractionally. And you consider yourself a true musician, Miss Grantham? I consider music my life's greatest joy and most honest expression, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. Whether that qualifies me in your estimation is, of course, entirely your determination. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, those grey eyes unreadable. Then, unexpectedly, he inclined his head slightly. Continue as you see fit, Miss Grantham. We shall evaluate Margaret's progress at the end of the month. It wasn't approval, precisely, but neither was it dismissal. As he turned to leave, he added, my sister and her husband are visiting from the country this weekend. There will be a small musical gathering on Saturday evening. Your presence is requested. To play for your guests. Precisely. 7 o'clock. Mrs. Winters will advise you on appropriate attire. His gaze flickered briefly over her dress before he departed, leaving Viola uncertain whether she had just won a small victory or merely postponed an inevitable defeat. When she returned to the music room, Margaret was picking out a simple melody with one finger. Is he very angry? The girl asked without looking up. He doesn't show it, you know. Not like normal people. He just goes quieter and quieter until you feel like you're disappointing the entire British Empire. Viola laughed despite herself. He's not angry. Just particular. He wasn't always like this, Margaret said, her young face suddenly solemn. Mamma said he used to laugh. Before. But Margaret only shrugged, returning her attention to the keyboard. Are you going to make me practice scales for another hour? 20 more minutes of scales, Viola compromised, and then I'll teach you a new piece. Something with a story behind it. As the girl beamed in response, Viola found herself wondering what had happened to transform the Duke from a man who laughed to one who seemed carved from ice. And why, despite every sensible instinct, she felt an increasingly urgent desire to discover the man beneath that perfect, polished exterior. That small gathering on Saturday evening proved to be Viola's introduction to the inner circle of London's haute ton. 24 of society's elite filled the Duke's drawing room, the ladies resplendent in silks and jewels, the gentlemen distinguished in evening attire. Viola, in a modest gown of deep green that Mrs. Winters had helped her select from the household store of garments kept for occasional performers, felt distinctly out of place. She had been positioned at the pianoforte in the corner of the room, playing quiet background pieces as guests arrived and engaged in the intricate social dance of the aristocracy. The Duke moved among them with practiced ease, though Viola noted he smiled rarely and laughed not at all. His sister, Lady Penelope Raeburn, proved to be his temperamental opposite, vivacious, warm, and possessed of the same striking grey eyes, though hers danced with mischief where his remained coolly assessing. She approached the pianoforte during a brief pause between pieces, her silk skirts rustling elegantly. Miss Grantham, I presume? I've heard such praise of your playing from my niece. Viola rose and curtsied. You're very kind, Lady Raeburn. Lady Margaret is a delightful student. And my brother? Is he a delightful employer? Her smile was conspiratorial. His Grace has been correct in all our dealings, Viola replied carefully. Lady Raeburn laughed. How diplomatically phrased. Alexander has always inspired such caution in those he employs. A pity, really, as he was once the most approachable of men. Before Viola could respond, the Duke himself appeared at his sister's elbow. I see you're neglecting your duties as hostess to interrogate my staff, Penny. I'm merely introducing myself to the woman who has apparently worked miracles with Margaret. The child actually volunteered to play for us before dinner." She turned back to Viola. "A remarkable achievement, Miss Grantham. My brother hired and dismissed 3 instructors before you, all of whom declared Margaret hopeless." "She is far from hopeless," Viola said firmly. "She simply needs music that speaks to her imagination." The Duke's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. "Miss Grantham favors an unconventional approach." "Then she's exactly what this household needs," Lady Rayburn declared. "Now, Alexander, you simply must introduce me to Mrs. Fairchild. I understand her son has returned from the continent with the most scandalous stories." As she swept her brother away, Viola noticed a gentleman observing her from across the room. Handsome in a conventional way, with fair hair and an expression of undisguised interest, he made his way toward her as she began a Mozart sonata. "Exquisitely played," he commented, leaning against the pianoforte with casual familiarity. "Though I'd wager you're capable of much more passionate performances in more intimate settings." Viola's fingers nearly faltered on the keys. "I'm afraid I don't have the pleasure of your acquaintance, sir." "Thomas Illingworth, at your service." He offered a bow just slightly too shallow to be respectful. "And the pleasure, I assure you, would be entirely mutual." His meaning was unmistakable, and Viola felt heat rise to her face, not from flattery, but from indignation. "You mistake me, Mr. Illingworth. I am employed here as Lady Margaret's music instructor, not as entertainment for guests." "A pity," he murmured, his gaze drifting insultingly over her figure. "Though I suppose even music teachers must have their moments of recreation." "Mr. Illingworth." The Duke's voice, though quiet, cut through the ambient conversation like a blade. He had approached so silently that both Viola and Illingworth started. "I believe Lady Horacefield was looking for you. Something about a promising investment opportunity." Illingworth straightened, his manner instantly more formal. "Harrington. Didn't see you there. Merely complimenting your musician on her skill." "Indeed." The single word contained volumes of disbelief. "Miss Grantham, would you be so kind as to accompany Lady Margaret for her performance? I believe she's waiting in the music room." Grateful for the escape, Viola rose immediately. As she passed the Duke, he added in an undertone, "My apologies. Illingworth is my brother-in-law's cousin and rather too aware of his own charm." "No apology necessary, Your Grace." His gaze met hers briefly. "You handled him with admirable composure." It wasn't precisely a compliment, yet Viola felt unreasonably pleased as she made her way to where Margaret waited, fidgeting nervously in her best evening dress. "I think I shall be sick," the girl whispered as Viola entered. "There are so many people, and Cousin Alexander will be disappointed if I play poorly." Viola took her hands. "Listen to me. When you play, don't think of them at all. Think of the story we created for this piece, the woodland sprites dancing in the moonlight, remember? Play it for them, not for the fancy lords and ladies." Margaret's expression brightened. "Do you really think that will work?" "I know it will." Viola squeezed her hands. "And I'll be right beside you, turning the pages." When they returned to the drawing room, the guests had arranged themselves to observe the performance. Margaret seated herself at the pianoforte, took a deep breath, and began to play the simple but charming minuet they had practiced all week. Viola, standing beside her, was aware of the Duke watching intently from across the room. As Margaret played the final notes, not perfectly, but with genuine feeling, enthusiastic applause broke out. The girl's face flushed with pleasure as she curtsied. Later, after the guests had departed and Margaret had been sent to bed, Viola was gathering her music when the Duke entered the music room. "She played well," he said, surprising Viola with this unexpected acknowledgement. "She did. She has natural talent, Your Grace." He moved to the pianoforte, running his fingers lightly over the closed lid. "My sister believes I've been too strict with her. Too concerned with proper form over genuine feeling." "And what do you believe?" Viola asked, emboldened by the lateness of the hour and the unusual openness in his manner. He was silent so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, I believe structure provides safety. Boundaries within which one may operate without risk. Without risk of what? His gaze, when it met hers, contained something she had not seen before, a vulnerability quickly masked. Disappointment. Loss. The usual hazards of human feeling. The simple honesty of the statement caught her off guard. Before she could formulate a response, he straightened, his manner once again formal. You played beautifully this evening, Miss Grantham. Your services were much appreciated. He withdrew an envelope from his coat and placed it on the pianoforte. A small token of that appreciation. Thank you, but the agreed-upon compensation is more than generous, this is additional. I insist. His tone brooked no argument. The carriage will take you home, of course. And with a brief nod, he was gone, leaving Viola with the distinct impression that she had glimpsed something rare and precious, a momentary crack in the Duke's perfect armor, revealing a man of deeper feelings than she had imagined. Over the following weeks, Viola's position in the Valemore household gradually shifted. Margaret's progress at the pianoforte was evident to all, and the Duke, while still formal, began to show occasional flashes of the man Lady Rayburn had described, thoughtful, observant, possessed of a dry wit that emerged in rare, unguarded moments. One rainy afternoon, Viola arrived for Margaret's lesson to find the girl had been invited to a friend's home for tea. Mrs. Winters informed her that the Duke requested her presence in the library instead. She found him seated at a desk covered with papers, a frown of concentration creasing his brow. He looked up as she entered, and for an instant, his expression softened. Miss Grantham. Thank you for coming. I apologize for the change in plans, but an opportunity has arisen that I thought might interest you. He gestured to a stack of sheet music on a side table. These arrived from Vienna yesterday. New compositions, including several by Beethoven that have not yet been widely circulated in England. Viola approached the table with undisguised eagerness. His new piano sonatas? I've heard rumors, but see for yourself. The music was indeed Beethoven's latest work, along with pieces by Schubert and several composers unfamiliar to her. Viola handled the pages reverently. This is extraordinarily generous, Your Grace. Not generosity, he corrected. Self-interest. I should like to hear these played as they were intended, not massacred by society misses who consider music merely another accomplishment to display alongside watercolors and embroidery. The corner of his mouth lifted in what might almost have been a smile. Besides, your expression when confronted with new music is rather gratifying. Viola felt a blush rise to her cheeks. Am I so transparent? Only in matters of music. He set aside his papers and rose. Will you play something now? I find my concentration lacking today, and good music often restores it. She needed no further encouragement. Seating herself at the small pianoforte in the corner of the library, she selected one of Schubert's newest pieces and began to play. The music was intricate and emotive, demanding both technical precision and interpretive sensitivity. When she finished, she looked up to find the Duke standing near, his expression uncharacteristically open. You play as if you understand exactly what the composer intended, he said quietly. As if you can hear the story behind the notes. Music is always telling a story, she replied. Even when the composer doesn't consciously intend it. And what story did you hear in this piece? Viola considered. Longing. A search for something just beyond reach. Beauty tinged with melancholy. His eyes held hers. You find meaning where others see merely notes on a page. Don't you? She asked. When you listen, don't you feel the composer speaking directly to you? I once did. His admission was so quiet she nearly missed it. And now? He turned away, moving to the window. Now I appreciate the mathematics of it. The structure. The predictable patterns. That's not music, Your Grace. That's merely its skeleton. He glanced back at her, a faint smile touching his lips. You're remarkably forthright for someone in your position, Miss Grantham. My apologies if I've overstepped. No. He shook his head. It's refreshing. Few people speak to me with such honesty. An unexpected warmth bloomed in Viola's chest at this acknowledgement. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the usual barriers of rank and circumstance somehow temporarily suspended. The spell was broken by the arrival of the butler, announcing a visitor. The Duke's expression immediately resumed its customary reserve. Thank you for indulging my request, Miss Grantham. Please, take any of the music that interests you. Consider it on indefinite loan. As she gathered her things to depart, he added, the annual Valemore Summer Ball is in 3 weeks' time. I should like you to play, if you're willing. It's a significant occasion. I would be honored, Your Grace. Only after she had left did Viola realize he had never mentioned compensation for this additional performance. More surprising still was her own lack of concern about the matter. The opportunity to play at such a prestigious event, and perhaps to see that rare, unguarded expression on the Duke's face once more, seemed compensation enough. A dangerous line of thinking, she reminded herself sternly as she walked home through the clearing weather. The Duke's momentary warmth signified nothing more than appreciation for her musical abilities. To imagine otherwise would be the height of folly. Yet that evening, as she practiced one of the new Beethoven sonatas in her modest rooms, she found herself wondering if music might indeed build bridges across the vast social divide that separated them, not toward any romantic notion, of course, but toward a genuine understanding between two people who shared, despite all their differences, a common language of the soul. The night of the Valemore Ball arrived with all the splendor befitting one of the season's most anticipated events. Carriages lined the street outside the mansion, disgorging London's elite in their finest attire. Inside, the ballroom glittered with hundreds of candles reflecting in gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers. Viola, stationed at the grand pianoforte on a small dais, wore a gown of deep blue silk, a gift from Lady Rayburn, who had insisted that anyone representing the Valemore household must be properly attired. The dress, with its empire waist and modest neckline, was far finer than anything Viola had ever owned, and she felt both conspicuous and oddly confident as her fingers moved across the keys. She played as the guests arrived and circulated, offering a selection of fashionable music suitable for conversation. The Duke, resplendent in formal evening attire with the blue ribbon of some royal order across his chest, moved among his guests with practiced ease, though Viola noted he smiled rarely and laughed not at all. Lady Rayburn, who had arrived from the country specifically for the ball, appeared at Viola's side during a brief pause. You play beautifully, my dear. And that color suits you perfectly. Thanks to your generosity, Lady Rayburn. The gown is far too fine, nonsense. It's exactly what you deserve. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. I've never seen Alexander so attentive to any music instructor before. He actually listened to an entire sonata last week without once checking his pocket watch. A miracle, I assure you. Viola felt her cheeks warm. His Grace has been most supportive of Lady Margaret's progress. Oh, it's not Margaret's progress that keeps him lingering in the music room, Lady Rayburn replied with a knowing smile. My brother may be many things, but transparent he is not. At least, not to most people. Before Viola could respond to this bewildering statement, the Duke himself approached, escorting an elderly woman of distinguished bearing. Miss Grantham, may I present the Dowager Countess of Strathmere? Lady Strathmere, Miss Viola Grantham, my ward's music instructor. The Countess inspected Viola through a jeweled lorgnette. So you're the young woman Alexander has mentioned. He tells me you play with unusual sensitivity. His Grace is too kind, Viola murmured, flustered by the idea that the Duke had discussed her with others. My brother, Lady Rayburn said with a mischievous glance at him, is rarely accused of excessive kindness. If he praised your playing, Miss Grantham, it was because you genuinely impressed him. The Duke's expression remained impassive, but Viola thought she detected a faint flush along his jawline. My sister exaggerates, as usual. However, Lady Strathmere has requested you play something of your own choosing before the dancing begins. Something to demonstrate your particular interpretation. It was both an opportunity and a test. Viola understood instantly that Lady Strathmere, despite her advanced years, remained an influential figure in society. Her approval could open doors that would otherwise remain firmly closed to someone of Viola's background. Rising to the challenge, Viola selected not the safe, conventional piece she had planned, but Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, passionate, technically demanding, and emotionally charged. As the ballroom quieted, she allowed herself one glance at the Duke. He stood slightly apart from the crowd, his expression unreadable. Taking a deep breath, she began to play. The music filled the grand space, silencing conversation. Viola lost herself in the composition, feeling each phrase as if it were her own personal statement to the assembled company, and particularly to the tall, reserved man who watched her with such focused attention. When the final notes died away, there was a moment of absolute silence before applause erupted. Lady Strathmere nodded approvingly, and Lady Rayburn beamed. But it was the Duke's reaction Viola sought. He stood perfectly still, his eyes never leaving her face, something like wonder in his expression. The moment was broken by the dancing master's announcement that the first set was forming. The Duke was immediately claimed by a beautiful young woman in pale pink, and Viola turned her attention to the series of country dances and waltzes that would occupy the next several hours. It was well past midnight when the ball began to wind down. Viola's fingers ached pleasantly from hours of playing, and she was just considering whether she might slip away when the Duke appeared at her side. "You must be exhausted," he said, his voice pitched low for her ears alone. "Yet you've played tirelessly all evening." "It has been a pleasure, Your Grace. The instrument is magnificent, and your guests appreciative." "Come," he said unexpectedly. "You deserve some refreshment." He led her to a small antechamber off the ballroom where a table had been set with light repast for the musicians. But rather than leaving her there, he poured 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to her. "To your success this evening," he said, touching his glass lightly to hers. "Lady Strathmere is not easily impressed, yet she spoke of your playing in terms I've not heard her use in 20 years. Viola sipped the champagne, its bubbles as effervescent as her spirits. "I'm honored by her approval." "As well you should be. She was once the patroness of some of London's finest musical talents." He hesitated, then added, "She has offered to introduce you to several families seeking an accomplished instructor for their daughters. Far grander houses than a small seminary for young ladies." The champagne suddenly tasted flat on Viola's tongue. "You wish me to leave my position with Lady Margaret?" "Not at all." He looked genuinely startled by her conclusion. "But surely additional pupils among the ton would be advantageous to your circumstances." "I see." Of course he would think of her financial situation. What else would concern him? "That's very considerate, Your Grace." He studied her face. "You're displeased." "Why?" How could she explain that for a moment, a foolish, impossible moment, she had imagined his interest might be personal rather than practical? That Lady Rayburn's hints and his own unusual attentiveness had led her to hope for something beyond professional recognition. Not displeased, she managed. Merely surprised. "Lady Margaret has made such progress, I would not wish to divide my attention too greatly." A commendable sentiment. He set down his glass. "However, the opportunity remains should you wish to pursue it." The distance between them, momentarily bridged, suddenly yawned wide again. Viola felt the familiar ache of reality reasserting itself. She was an employee, he was a duke, and any other consideration was mere fantasy. "Thank you for thinking of my welfare," she said, her composure carefully restored. "And for the champagne." He nodded once, his own reserve firmly back in place. "The carriage will take you home whenever you're ready. And Miss Grantham," he paused at the doorway. "Your playing tonight was extraordinary." "Truly." Left alone, Viola closed her eyes, willing her foolish heart to remember its place. Yet even as she chided herself for momentary weakness, she could not forget the expression in his eyes as she played the Beethoven, as if, for those few minutes, she had reached past his defenses to touch something long buried beneath that perfect, aristocratic control. The weeks following the ball brought unexpected changes to Viola's circumstances. True to the Duke's word, Lady Strathmere's influence opened doors to several prestigious households seeking music instruction for their daughters. Viola found herself suddenly in demand among families who would previously have considered her beneath notice. More surprising still was the Duke's continued interest in her musical opinions. He began to invite her to remain after Margaret's lessons, ostensibly to discuss the child's progress but increasingly to converse about music, literature, and occasionally politics, though on the latter subject, Viola was careful to express only the most moderate views. On a particularly fine June afternoon, she arrived at Valemore House to find preparations underway for some event. Servants bustled about with flowers and linens, and Mrs. Winters was directing the arrangement of refreshments in the drawing-room. "Ah, Miss Grantham," the housekeeper greeted her. "Lady Margaret is waiting in the garden pavilion today. His Grace thought the fine weather too precious to waste indoors." The garden behind the mansion was an unexpected oasis in the heart of London, a well-planned space with gravel paths winding among flowerbeds, ornamental shrubs, and even a small stand of trees. At its centre stood an elegant pavilion, open on all sides to catch summer breezes. Viola found Margaret there, but no sign of the pianoforte. Instead, the girl was seated on a bench, swinging her legs impatiently. "Miss Grantham! Finally! Cousin Alexander said I needn't have a lesson today because of the party, but that you would take me on a nature walk instead to collect specimens for my botany album." "Did he indeed?" Viola replied, bemused. This was the first she had heard of any such plan. "It's a surprise," came the Duke's voice as he appeared on the path. He wore a less formal coat than usual, and his cravat was tied in a simpler style that somehow suited him better than his typical precise arrangements. "I hope you don't mind, Miss Grantham. Margaret has been longing to explore the park, and I recalled you mentioned an interest in botanical drawing." "I did mention it, yes," Viola said, remembering a casual conversation weeks earlier. "Though I'm hardly an expert." "You draw flowers beautifully," Margaret insisted. "You showed me your sketches of the lilies. Cousin Alexander said we might go to the new public gardens if you approved." Viola looked to the Duke, who appeared almost nervous. Surely not. Yet there was an unusual quality to his manner as he awaited her response. "I would be delighted," she said finally. "Though I'm not dressed for an excursion." "Mrs. Winters has set aside a more suitable pelisse and bonnet in the small parlour," he replied. "If you would care to change, the carriage will be ready in 15 minutes. You're accompanying us?" Viola couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. A faint smile touched his lips. "Unless that would be unwelcome." "No. That is, it's most unexpected, but certainly not unwelcome." His smile deepened fractionally. "Excellent. Then I shall await you both at the carriage." As he strode away, Margaret giggled. "He's been planning this for days. Mrs. Winters said he's been like a boy with a new pony, checking the weather reports hourly." "Lady Margaret," Viola admonished gently, though her pulse had quickened at the implication. "It's not proper to repeat servants' gossip." But Margaret only grinned. "It's not gossip if it's true. And Mrs. Winters has been with the family since before I was born. She says Cousin Alexander hasn't been this interested in anything beyond business and duty since what?" Viola couldn't help asking when the girl hesitated. "Since before the tragedy," Margaret replied, suddenly solemn. "But no one will tell me exactly what happened. Only that it changed him." Before Viola could inquire further, the girl bounded up. "Come. We mustn't keep him waiting. He hates tardiness." The outing proved to be one of the most pleasant afternoons of Viola's life. The new public gardens were a marvel of landscape design, with winding paths, ornamental ponds, and carefully cultivated plantings from around the world. Margaret, armed with a small album and pencils, darted from flower to flower, making quick sketches and collecting fallen petals for pressing. Most surprising was the Duke himself. Away from the constraints of society, he revealed a side Viola had glimpsed only in fragments, knowledgeable about botany, attentive to his ward's enthusiasm, and possessed of a dry wit that emerged in quiet asides that frequently made Viola laugh. When Margaret ran ahead to examine a particularly exotic bloom, they found themselves momentarily alone on a secluded path bordered by high hedges. "Thank you for indulging this scheme," he said. "Margaret has been cooped up with her studies, and I thought—" "It was a wonderful idea," Viola assured him. "She needs fresh air and sunshine as much as scales and etudes. As do we all, perhaps." He glanced at her, a hint of uncertainty in his expression. "I've been considering taking her to Valemore Park for the remainder of the summer. The countryside would be beneficial for her health. I'm sure she would thrive there." "Yes." He hesitated. "The difficulty is her education. The local vicar's wife could continue her general studies, but her music—" Viola's heart sank. "I understand. You'll want to engage someone nearby." "Actually," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "I had hoped you might consider accompanying us. As Margaret's instructor, of course. With appropriate compensation and accommodations." Viola stopped walking, too stunned to continue. "You wish me to come to Valemore Park?" "For the entire summer." "If that would not be inconvenient," he replied, his tone carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. "Your other pupils could be resumed in the autumn." 1,000 considerations raced through Viola's mind: her modest rooms in London, her few other students, the propriety of such an arrangement. Yet overshadowing all was the prospect of weeks in the Duke's company, away from the rigid structures of London society. "I would need to make arrangements," she said slowly. "My landlady, all expenses would be covered, naturally." He paused. "And your position in the household would be clearly established." "My aunt will be in residence as nominal chaperone, though she rarely emerges before noon and retires immediately after dinner." The careful precision of these details suggested he had given the matter considerable thought. Viola found herself both touched and wary. What exactly was he proposing? Merely a continuation of her employment under different circumstances, or something more? "May I have some time to consider?" she asked finally. "Of course." He nodded, his expression unreadable once more. "Though we depart in 5 days' time." Margaret's return prevented further discussion, but throughout the remainder of their excursion, Viola found herself watching the Duke with new eyes. The careful distance he maintained from others, the rare moments when his guard slipped to reveal genuine feeling, the obvious affection he held for his ward despite his reserved manner, all formed a portrait of a man far more complex than the cold aristocrat she had initially perceived. By the time they returned to Valemore House, Viola had made her decision. Whatever risks might lie in accepting his invitation, the prospect of declining, of returning to her solitary rooms while imagining Margaret and the Duke at Valemore Park without her, seemed suddenly unbearable. "I should be delighted to accompany you to the country," she told him as he handed her down from the carriage. His fingers tightened momentarily around hers. "I am very glad to hear it, Miss Grantham." The genuine warmth in his voice sent a thrill of anticipation through her, followed immediately by a warning. She was accepting a position as an employee in his household, nothing more. To imagine any other significance would lead only to disappointment. Yet as she watched him lift Margaret down with gentle hands, his usual stern expression softened by the afternoon's pleasure, Viola couldn't quite silence the treacherous whisper of her heart, what if? Valemore Park exceeded all Viola's expectations. The ancestral seat of the Dukes of Harrington was not the forbidding fortress she had imagined, but a harmonious queen and mansion set amid rolling parkland, with formal gardens giving way to wildflower meadows and ancient woodlands beyond. The Duke's aunt, Lady Augusta Valemore, proved to be a formidable but largely absent figure who, as predicted, showed little interest in anything beyond her novels and correspondence. Margaret, freed from the constraints of London, blossomed in the country air, dividing her time between music lessons, outdoor excursions, and the company of the vicar's children, who became regular visitors. Most surprising was the transformation in the Duke himself. Here, among the scenes of his childhood, he seemed to shed layers of reserve like an overworn coat. He still maintained the dignity befitting his station, but his smiles came more frequently, his conversation flowed more easily, and occasionally, to Viola's delight, he even laughed. 3 weeks into their stay, Viola was returning from a solitary walk when she heard music coming from the grand salon. Curious, she followed the sound to find the Duke seated at the pianoforte, playing a simple but elegant Mozart sonata. He was not a virtuoso, but his technique was precise, his interpretation thoughtful. He looked up as she entered, his fingers stilling on the keys. "Please don't stop," she said quickly. "I had no idea you played." "Badly," he replied with a self-deprecating smile that transformed his features. "And rarely. A gentleman is expected to appreciate music, not perform it." "You play beautifully," she countered, moving closer. "With genuine feeling." He shook his head, but his expression remained open. "I lack your gift for expression. My teachers always complained I was too technical, too concerned with precision over emotion." "Perhaps you simply needed the right music," Viola suggested, emboldened by his unusual candor. "May I?" He rose, gesturing for her to take his place. Seated at the instrument, Viola considered for a moment before beginning a piece she had been composing in the quiet evenings at Valemore Park, a simple, lyrical melody inspired by the beauty of the estate and its master's gradual awakening from whatever sorrow had enclosed him. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "That was—" "I don't recognize the composition," he said finally. "It's nothing published," she admitted. "Just something I've been working on." "You compose as well?" His surprise was evident. "Merely for my own pleasure." "Nothing serious." "It was beautiful." He moved to sit beside her on the bench, careful to maintain a proper distance. "Would you or might I hear more of your work?" The request, so genuinely offered, touched her deeply. For the next hour, they remained at the pianoforte together, Viola playing her modest compositions while the Duke listened with genuine appreciation. Occasionally he would ask a question about a particular passage or suggest a slight variation, revealing a deeper understanding of music than she had suspected. As the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, casting golden patterns across the floor, Viola realized with a start how much time had passed. "I've monopolized your afternoon," she said, rising hastily. "You must have important matters requiring attention." "None more important than this." The quiet certainty in his voice held her in place. "Miss Grantham, Viola, your music has brought something back to Valemore that has been missing for too long." The use of her given name, so unexpected, sent a tremor through her. "What would that be, Your Grace?" "Joy," he said simply. "And I find myself unwilling to return to a life without it." Before she could respond to this extraordinary statement, the door opened to admit Margaret and Lady Augusta's companion, returning from an expedition to the village. The moment of intimacy shattered, but the memory of his words, and the look in his eyes as he spoke them, lingered in Viola's thoughts long into the night. The following days brought subtle but unmistakable changes in their relationship. The Duke sought her company beyond Margaret's lessons, inviting her to join his daily rides, requesting her presence at dinner even when no other guests were expected, and spending long evenings in conversation that ranged far beyond music to literature, philosophy, and their personal histories. Viola learned that he had been thrust into the dukedom unexpectedly at 23 when his father and older brother drowned in a boating accident. Lady Raeburn's hints about a tragedy began to make sense, though she sensed there was more to the story than he revealed. For her part, Viola shared the circumstances of her own life, her father, a modestly successful composer who had trained her from childhood, her mother's early death, and the financial reversals that had necessitated her career as a teacher rather than the performer her father had envisioned. "He would be proud of you," the Duke, Alexander, as she had begun to think of him, though never to his face, told her one evening as they walked in the garden after dinner. "Your talent deserves a wider audience than a few society daughters." "I'm content with my situation," she replied, though the wistfulness in her voice betrayed her. "Not everyone is meant for public acclaim." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the fading light. "What if there were another option? Private patronage is not uncommon for musicians of exceptional talent." Viola stiffened. "Are you offering to be my patron, Your Grace?" Would that be so objectionable? He asked, studying her face. It would be complicated. She chose her words carefully. Such arrangements often come with expectations beyond music. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed swiftly by dismay. I have given you cause to think that my intentions, he broke off, clearly disturbed. Forgive me. I had not considered how my suggestion might be interpreted. There is nothing to forgive, Viola assured him, embarrassed by her presumption. I merely meant that any financial dependence creates certain obligations that might constrain artistic freedom. An insightful observation. His expression cleared somewhat, though a trace of distress remained. Please believe that I would never propose anything that might compromise your dignity or independence. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Impulsively, Viola touched his arm. I know that. Truly. For a moment, they stood in silence, the evening air heavy with unspoken words. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back, restoring the proper distance between them. It grows late, he said formally. Allow me to escort you back to the house. As they walked side by side through the twilit garden, Viola sensed that something significant had shifted between them, a boundary acknowledged, perhaps, but also a deeper understanding. Whatever his feelings might be, Alexander Valemore was a man of honor. And whatever her own heart might wish, Viola Grantham understood the realities of their respective positions too well to indulge in impossible dreams. ****** The annual village festival, traditionally opened by the Duke himself, brought unexpected revelations. The entire household traveled to the village green, where booths, games, and a small platform for musicians had been erected. Local families bowed or curtsied as the Duke passed, but their greetings held genuine warmth rather than mere deference. His Grace has always been good to the village, explained Mrs. Winters, who had accompanied them. Even more so since the Troubles. When the poor harvests came 3 years past, he reduced rents and imported grain at his own expense. There's not a family here that hasn't benefited from his generosity. This glimpse of Alexander as a responsible landowner, caring for those dependent on him, added yet another dimension to Viola's understanding of him. As she watched him judge a children's art display, awarding prizes with grave courtesy to beaming recipients, she felt her heart swell with an emotion she could no longer deny, however imprudent it might be. The festival's highlight was to be musical performances by local talents, followed by dancing. To Viola's surprise, the village organizer approached her directly. Beg your pardon, miss, but we've heard from Lady Margaret that you're a musician of rare gifts. Would you honor us with a performance before the dancing begins? Viola hesitated, glancing toward the Duke, who stood nearby in conversation with the vicar. I couldn't possibly. Please, Miss Grantham. Margaret appeared at her elbow, eyes bright with excitement. I've told everyone how beautifully you play, and they're all so eager to hear you. Put that way, refusal seemed impossible. Very well. Though I'm hardly prepared, the schoolmaster's pianoforte is on the platform, the organizer assured her. Nothing grand like his Grace's, to be sure, but it's been tuned special for today. Before she quite knew how it had happened, Viola found herself seated at a modest instrument on the village platform, facing an expectant audience of local families, tenant farmers, and household staff. In the front row sat Margaret, practically bouncing with anticipation. Beside her, the Duke watched with an expression of quiet interest. Without accompaniment or prepared music, Viola chose to play from memory, first a sprightly Mozart piece that would appeal to the general audience, then one of her own compositions, the melody she had played for Alexander that afternoon in the salon. As the final notes faded, she was startled by the enthusiastic applause that erupted. The villagers rose to their feet, genuine appreciation on their weather-worn faces. Margaret clapped until her hands must have been sore, and even Lady Augusta nodded approvingly. But it was the Duke's reaction that caught and held her attention. He remained seated, his expression one of complete absorption, as if he had momentarily forgotten his surroundings. When their eyes met across the crowd, something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgement of the power of music to express what words could not. Later, As the village musicians struck up country dances and the green filled with whirling couples, he approached her where she stood watching the festivities. "Your performance was extraordinary," he said without preamble. "Particularly the second piece." "Thank you," she replied, warmed by his praise. "It wasn't prepared, it was the composition you played for me," he interrupted gently. "The one you said was inspired by Valemore Park." She nodded, suddenly shy. "The estate has a particular atmosphere that seems to demand musical expression." "Just the estate?" His gaze was intent, searching. Before she could formulate a response, they were interrupted by Margaret, who seized both their hands in her small ones. "You must dance," she insisted. "Everyone is dancing, and you're both just standing here like posts." Alexander's expression shifted to one of fond exasperation. "Margaret, it wouldn't be appropriate for, why not?" the girl demanded with the devastating directness of childhood. "Miss Grantham isn't a servant, she's our friend. And you told Aunt Augusta just yesterday that she was the most remarkable woman you'd ever, Margaret." His tone silenced her instantly, though a mutinous expression remained on her face. "That will do." Viola's heart had begun a rapid, uneven rhythm at the girl's half-revealed confidence. The Duke turned to her, his composure somewhat recovered though a faint flush colored his cheekbones. "My ward occasionally suffers from an excess of imagination," he said stiffly. "However, if you would care to join the dancing." The village dance in progress was a simple one, far removed from the elaborate patterns of London ballrooms. Couples of all ages moved through the figures with more enthusiasm than precision, their faces alight with simple pleasure. "I would be delighted," Viola said softly. His surprise was evident, but he offered his arm without hesitation, leading her into the circle of dancers. The touch of his hand against hers as they moved through the pattern sent warmth spreading through her entire body. They barely spoke, yet Viola felt as if an entire conversation was taking place in the meeting of their eyes, the careful pressure of his fingers against her waist during the turns. When the music ended, they remained standing close together, momentarily oblivious to the bustling activity around them. "Viola," he began, his voice low and uncertain, "I must speak with you about, Your Grace." The village magistrate appeared before them, bowing apologetically. "Forgive the interruption, but Lady Augusta is asking for the carriage. She finds the evening air too chill." Alexander's expression closed like a door shutting. "Of course. Please inform her we shall depart shortly." The opportunity lost, they returned to the house in near silence, the carriage filled with Margaret's excited chatter and Lady Augusta's occasional tart observations. Yet as they descended at the entrance to Valemore Park, Alexander touched Viola's arm briefly. "Would you join me in the library after Margaret retires? There is something I wish to discuss." Her pulse quickening, she nodded. "Of course, Your Grace." The hour that passed before their appointed meeting seemed interminable. Viola changed from her festival attire into a simple evening dress, her mind racing with possibilities. What did he wish to discuss? Margaret's progress? Her own compositions? Or perhaps, but no, she must not allow herself to hope for impossibilities. When she entered the library, she found him standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames. He turned at her entrance, and the intensity of his gaze nearly stopped her breath. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "Please, be seated." She took the chair he indicated, her hands folded tightly in her lap to disguise their trembling. "I find myself in an unexpected position," he began after a moment. "When I invited you to Valemore Park, my intentions were entirely proper, to secure Margaret's musical education in pleasant surroundings, away from London's distractions." "As I understood," Viola affirmed, her throat suddenly dry. "Yes. However?" He paused, seeming to struggle for words, an unusual circumstance for a man typically so articulate. "However, I did not anticipate how your presence would affect the household." "Affect me?" Her heart began to race. "I don't understand, Your Grace." "Don't you?" He moved suddenly, kneeling before her chair so their eyes were level, a shocking breach of propriety that revealed the depth of his agitation. Viola, surely you must know that I have come to regard you with feelings far beyond those appropriate between employer and employee. The directness of his statement left her momentarily speechless. He continued, words coming more rapidly now, as if a dam had broken. Your music first caught my attention, yes. But it is your character, your intelligence, your kindness to Margaret, your understanding of beauty in all its forms, that has captured my heart. I have tried to maintain proper distance, to remember the vast gulf between our stations, but I find myself increasingly unable to deny the truth. Which is, she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. That I love you. The words, so simply stated, seemed to surprise him as much as her. That I cannot imagine returning to a life without your presence, your conversation, your music. Viola's mind whirled with conflicting emotions, joy, disbelief, an overwhelming uncertainty. Alexander, your Grace, you cannot mean, I do mean it, he interrupted, taking her hands in his. With complete sincerity. But I understand the gravity of what I'm suggesting. The challenges you would face as my wife, the scrutiny of society, the whispers about your background. I would not ask you to face such difficulties without being certain of your own feelings. Wife. The word hung in the air between them, impossible yet undeniable. Viola found herself trembling. Society would never accept such a match, she said, forcing herself to confront reality despite the joy threatening to overwhelm her reason. A duke and a music teacher? The scandal would be considerable, yes. His grip on her hands tightened. But not unprecedented. And I find, to my surprise, that I care far less for society's opinion than I once did. What I cannot bear is the thought of losing you. But your position, your responsibilities, will be fulfilled more completely with you at my side. His eyes held hers, unflinching. You understand duty, Viola. You've lived it every day, caring for your students, honoring your father's memory through your music. That sense of obligation, of doing what is right rather than what is easy, it's one of the qualities I most admire in you. Tears filled her eyes at his words, at the profound understanding they revealed. Alexander, a discreet knock at the door interrupted them. Alexander rose swiftly as his butler entered, maintaining a proper distance from Viola with visible effort. Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but an express has arrived from London. Lady Rayburn sends word that she is gravely ill and requests your immediate return. Alexander's expression shifted instantly to concern. Has the messenger been refreshed? Order the carriage prepared. We shall depart at first light. As the butler withdrew, Alexander turned back to Viola, conflict evident in his face. I must go to Penny. She would not send such a message without genuine need. Of course you must, Viola agreed immediately. She is your sister. This conversation, what I've said, he moved closer, his gaze intense. Nothing has changed, Viola. But I must ask for your patience until this matter is resolved. I understand, she assured him, though her heart ached at the interruption of this momentous exchange. Family must come first. He took her hand, pressing it briefly to his lips in a gesture of such tender reverence that fresh tears threatened. We will continue this discussion in London. I promise you. The journey back to the city the following day was subdued, with Margaret anxious about her aunt and Alexander preoccupied with concern. Viola maintained a calm exterior, focusing on comforting the child while her own thoughts remained in turmoil. Had the Duke truly proposed marriage? And if so, could such an extraordinary breach of social convention possibly lead to happiness for either of them? London greeted them with its usual noise and bustle, the transition from country peace to urban chaos particularly jarring after their abrupt departure. Lady Rayburn, they discovered upon arrival at her Mayfair home, had indeed been dangerously ill with lung fever, though the crisis had passed before they reached the city. Alexander, you needn't have rushed back, she chided weakly from her sickbed. Though I confess I'm delighted to see you all. Her knowing gaze lingered on Viola. Especially you, Miss Grantham. I understand from my brother's letters that you've been a most welcome addition to the household. Alexander, seated beside his sister's bed, shot her a warning glance that she cheerfully ignored. In fact, Lady Rayburn continued, he mentioned your musical compositions with such enthusiasm that I insisted he must arrange a private concert once you returned to London. Didn't you, Alexander? You were delirious with fever, he reminded her dryly. I agreed to nothing of the sort. Well, I'm perfectly lucid now, and I insist upon it. She smiled sweetly. Unless there's some reason you wouldn't wish to showcase Miss Grantham's remarkable talents to our circle. The charged silence that followed made it clear to Viola that Lady Rayburn suspected, or perhaps knew, something of her brother's feelings. Whether she approved or merely found the situation entertaining remained unclear. I would be honored to play for any gathering you might arrange, Viola said carefully, once you've fully recovered, of course. Splendid. Lady Rayburn beamed. Alexander, you shall make all the arrangements. Nothing too elaborate, just 30 or 40 of our closest friends. As they departed Lady Rayburn's residence, Viola found herself alone with Alexander in his carriage, Margaret having been sent ahead with Mrs. Winters. The privacy, after days of careful distance, was both welcome and daunting. My sister, he said after a moment, has always delighted in managing the affairs of others. Particularly mine. She cares for you, Viola observed. And she seems to be recovering well. Yes. He hesitated, then added, this concert she proposes, you need not feel obligated. Penny's enthusiasm often outruns propriety. I don't mind, truly. Viola smoothed her skirts, avoiding his gaze. Though I wonder at her purpose. Does she know about what was discussed at Valemore Park? Alexander's expression softened. Penny has always possessed an uncanny ability to discern my thoughts, often before I've fully acknowledged them myself. I've written to her regularly during our stay in the country, and she claims my letters revealed my feelings long before I admitted them aloud. And does she disapprove? Quite the contrary. A smile touched his lips. She informed me this afternoon, in no uncertain terms, that if I failed to secure your hand, I would prove myself the greatest fool in London. Viola's breath caught. Then the conversation we began, your intentions remain unchanged. He reached across the carriage to take her hand, his touch sending warmth through her despite the thin barrier of her glove. My feelings have only grown stronger, Viola. The question is whether yours are the same. The carriage was approaching Valemore House, their private moment rapidly drawing to a close. Viola looked into his eyes, finding there the same vulnerability she had glimpsed that night in the library, a man of power and privilege risking his heart, his reputation, his very place in society for love. They are, she said simply. Though I still fear the consequences for you. His fingers tightened around hers. Then we shall face them together. The drawing rooms of London buzzed with speculation in the weeks that followed. The Duke of Harrington, long considered one of the most eligible bachelors in England, had begun behaving in a most peculiar manner. He had been observed at the opera actually listening to the music rather than scanning the boxes for suitable matrimonial prospects. He had declined an invitation to Lady Jersey's exclusive rout in favour of a small musical evening at his sister's home. Most shocking of all, he had been seen walking in the park with his ward and her music instructor, his expression animated as he conversed with the latter. Lady Rayburn's promised concert, ostensibly to showcase new musical talents, became the most sought-after invitation of the late season. When the evening arrived, Valemore House was filled with the elite of London society, all curious about the mysterious Miss Grantham whose compositions had apparently captivated the normally reserved Duke. Viola, dressed in a gown of deep gold silk, another gift from Lady Rayburn, who had insisted that the occasion demanded something special, waited in the small antechamber adjacent to the music room, her heart racing with nerves. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions. Alexander had courted her with quiet determination, arranging private moments for conversation amid the demands of his position, each interaction deepening the connection between them. Yet they had not formally announced any understanding, aware that society would require careful preparation for such unprecedented news. The concert, Viola suspected, was Lady Rayburn's way of introducing her to the ton as a musician of merit before her relationship with Alexander became public knowledge. A rustle of silk announced Lady Raeburn's arrival, fully recovered and resplendent in blue satin. "There you are, my dear." Everyone is assembled, and Alexander is practically wearing a path in the carpet with his pacing. "I'm terrified," Viola admitted. "All those people." "Nonsense." Lady Raeburn adjusted a curl of Viola's hair with maternal fussiness. "You've played for crowned heads of Europe, according to my brother. Surely a few stuffy aristocrats can't intimidate you." "That's a slight exaggeration," Viola said with a nervous laugh. "I once performed at a small reception where a minor German prince was present." "Hardly the same." "Details." Lady Raeburn waved a dismissive hand. "The point is, you have extraordinary talent, and tonight everyone will recognize it." She paused, her expression softening. "Including those who might otherwise question your suitability for certain positions." So she did know. Viola felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Lady Raeburn, I never sought, of course you didn't." The older woman patted her hand. "That's precisely why you're perfect for him. Now, come along. Your audience awaits." The music room had been arranged to accommodate the unusually large gathering, with chairs placed in semicircles facing the pianoforte. Alexander stood near the instrument, tall and imposing in formal evening attire. His eyes found Viola immediately as she entered, and the warmth in his gaze steadied her nerves. Lady Raeburn made a brief introduction, describing Viola as a composer of remarkable sensitivity whose work deserves the ton's attention. Then, with an encouraging smile, she gestured for Viola to take her place at the pianoforte. Facing the assembled aristocracy, duchesses whose lineage stretched back centuries, earls who had never spoken to someone of her station except to give orders, fashionable matrons whose approval could make or break a reputation, Viola felt a moment of pure panic. Then her gaze found Alexander's, and in his expression she read complete confidence in her abilities. Taking a deep breath, she began to play. She had selected 4 pieces for the evening. First, a technically brilliant sonata by Mozart to demonstrate her classical training. Second, a romantic Beethoven piece that showcased her interpretive skills. Third, one of her father's compositions, a tribute to his memory and influence. And finally, her own work, the piece inspired by Valemore Park and its master. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of profound silence before applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic. Lady Strathmere was openly wiping tears from her eyes, and even the most reserved gentlemen were nodding in appreciation. Alexander stepped forward, his expression one of barely contained emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we have witnessed something extraordinary this evening. Miss Grantham's talent speaks for itself, but what you may not know is that she has achieved this mastery despite circumstances that would have defeated a lesser spirit." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience as he continued. "Following her father's death, Miss Grantham has supported herself through teaching, devoting what little free time remains to her own compositions. That she has developed such artistry without patronage or formal academy training is nothing short of remarkable." He turned to face Viola directly, his voice softening. "But it is not only her musical gifts that command admiration. Those fortunate enough to know Miss Grantham personally have discovered a woman of intelligence, compassion, and unimpeachable character." The room had grown absolutely silent, the assembled guests sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding before them. Viola sat frozen at the pianoforte, scarcely breathing as Alexander moved to stand beside her. "It is therefore with the greatest pleasure," he continued, his gaze never leaving her face, "that I announce Miss Grantham has done me the honor of accepting my hand in marriage." The shocked silence that followed was broken by Lady Raeburn's delighted applause, quickly joined by Lady Strathmere and, gradually, others in the room. Some faces registered disapproval or disbelief, but Viola barely noticed them. Alexander had taken her hand, drawing her to her feet beside him, his expression one of such undisguised love that all else faded from her awareness. "You might have warned me," she whispered, half laughing, half crying. "And miss the genuine surprise on your face." He smiled, the full, unrestrained smile she had come to treasure during their time at Valemore Park. "Besides, I feared if I hesitated any longer, my sister would make the announcement herself." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, some sincere, others merely polite. Lady Strathmere embraced Viola warmly, declaring herself vindicated in my assessment of your character, my dear. Margaret, allowed to stay up specially for the occasion, could barely contain her excitement at the prospect of having Miss Grantham forever and ever. It was well past midnight when the last guests departed, leaving only the immediate family, Alexander, Viola, Margaret, and Lady Rayburn, in the drawing-room. "Well," Lady Rayburn said with evident satisfaction, "that went rather better than I expected." Only Lady Horacefield looked as if she might faint, and that was primarily because she had hopes of securing you for her own daughter, Alexander. "You anticipated this announcement," Viola observed, still somewhat dazed by the evening's events. "My dear girl, I have been planning it since the moment my brother first mentioned you in his letters." Lady Rayburn smiled mischievously. "His descriptions of your playing were so infused with admiration that I knew immediately his interest was more than musical." Alexander shook his head, though his expression remained fond. "Penny has always believed herself uniquely qualified to arrange my affairs." "And with excellent results," his sister retorted. "Now, I shall take Margaret up to bed and leave you two to discuss whatever details remain to be settled. The wedding must be soon, I think, within the month, before the gossips have time to sharpen their knives." After they had departed, Viola found herself alone with Alexander for the first time since his very public declaration. Despite the understanding that had been growing between them for weeks, the reality of their engagement, now irrevocably announced to society, seemed suddenly overwhelming. "Are you certain?" she asked quietly. "There will be talk, disapproval from some quarters." "Let them talk." He took her hands, his expression serious. "Viola, I have spent my life fulfilling expectations, first my father's, then society's, finally my own rigid standards. Only with you have I remembered what it means to live with genuine feeling, to find joy in something beyond duty and propriety." Tears filled her eyes at the simple honesty of his words. "I never imagined, when I first came to this house, that I would find more than employment. Nor I, that hiring a piano teacher for Margaret would lead to the greatest happiness I have known." He drew her gently into his arms, his touch as reverent as if she were something infinitely precious. "Your music first caught my attention, yes. But it was your heart that ultimately captured mine." As his lips met hers in their first kiss, tender, questioning, then increasingly certain, Viola understood that the melody that had begun between them in those early days had developed into something far richer and more complex, a true duet, with each strengthening and complementing the other's voice. When they finally parted, Alexander touched her cheek gently. "Will you play for me? Not for an audience or for approval, just for us." Smiling through tears of joy, Viola returned to the pianoforte. As her fingers touched the keys, beginning the melody she had composed at Valemore Park, she felt the perfect rightness of this moment, of music freely given and received, of emotion expressed without words, of two souls finding in each other exactly what each had been missing. The Duke of Harrington stood watching the woman who would soon be his Duchess, his expression one of wonder and profound gratitude. He had hired her to play piano for his ward, never imagining that her music would stir his soul or awakening him from the emotional slumber that had claimed him since tragedy struck, reminding him that life's greatest compositions required both structure and passion, both discipline and joy. And as the music filled the room, wrapping around them like an embrace, both knew with absolute certainty